Okay, I'm going to call to order the Transportation, Energy, and Utility Committee of the City Council for our special meeting tonight at 6:32. And our first item on the agenda is the agenda, and I'll entertain a motion on that.
I would move that we adopt the agenda.
A second.
Any discussion on that? Seeing none, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye, and we have an agenda. Our agenda tonight is this symposium, so thank you all for coming. Yep. Welcome to this special meeting of the Transportation, Energy, and Utility Committee. The agenda and other meeting material including a program with panelist bios can be found on the city website at burlingtonvt.gov/citycouncil/TEUC. I'll also note that we have on a couple places, we have some hard copies of the program, and we have some QR codes at various spots in the room that you can use to bring that up on your device. Biomass electricity generation at McNeil Station is a topic that has recently received attention by the Vermont Climate Council and one that has generated significant public interest. Some have questioned the renewable status of biomass and called for a plan to phase out or close McNeil. Others argue that McNeil is our best option for reducing fossil fuel and is a sustainable alternative. So we have panelists here tonight, and I'll introduce them all to you now. First, we have Juliette Rooney-Varga. She's a professor at Kennedy School of Sciences, University of Massachusetts Lowell, the director of the Climate Change Initiative there. Professor Rooney-Varga is an internationally recognized expert in climate change and sustainability. We also have Dr. William Moomaw, Emeritus Professor of International Environmental Policy at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Professor Moomaw has worked at the intersection of science and policy, advocating for international sustainable development. He has been a long-time contributor to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and authored Perspective, a paper on proforestation. Next we have General Manager Darren Springer of Burlington Electric Department, where he's been general manager since 2018 and led a team that's developed Burlington's net zero energy roadmap, which the Smart Electric Power Alliance termed the first U.S. net zero 2030 plan. We also have Ali Kasiba, forest ecophysiologist and extension assistant professor of forestry at the University of Vermont. Professor Kasiba serves as a regional educator on forest carbon science and management and is the state lead on Vermont forest carbon inventory. Next we have Adam Sherman, senior consultant at VEIC, the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation. Mr. Sherman is a nationally recognized expert in renewable heating and cooling and is a biomass expert. And lastly, we have Harris Roan, a Vermont licensed forester with over 30 years working on public and private lands in the Northeast. His company, Longmeadow Resource Management, is a full-service forestry company covering northern Vermont. So that's our panel. The agenda, which has been shared, is going to be broken out into several blocks or a few blocks. The first on our agenda, we're going to hear from panelists who are going to present responses to questions that the TEUC has used as prompts for this discussion tonight. And Maddie has displayed those for us here. So all of these questions have been provided to the panelists, and they've had a chance to prepare their remarks based on these. After these discussions, or these presentations and discussions, we're going to have a short break, and then we're going to go into a series of questions that we've solicited from the public. We had a forum up for about a week, and we solicited questions, and the TEUC has curated some that we'll ask tonight and allow panelists to respond to. And lastly, we're going to have a public forum where if you haven't signed up and you want to speak at public forum, there's a sign-up sheet right here at this desk in front of me. And lastly, if we have any time at the end, we'll have an opportunity for TEUC members to ask follow-up questions. So we have a packed agenda tonight. We're going to get started, and our first...
Can I just say one thing?
Sure.
Like the buses that you might ride, or like going to church or some other religious thing, there are always seats in the front. There aren't a lot, but those of you who are in the back, or if people come in, know that there are other seats, and you can go upstairs the balcony and get the front rows, and so we should have plenty of seating for folks. So stand if you'd like, but there are seats available, so please take them. Thank you.
The other thing I was remiss in doing is introducing the other members of the Transportation, Energy, and Utility Committee. First, I'm Mark Barlow. I'm the chair. We have Hannah King, and we have Gene Bergman. Okay, so first, the first presenter is Darren Springer, General Manager at Burlington Electric. You can take it away, Darren.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, excellent. I am going to share my screen. So bear with me just a moment, and we'll have some slides that should pop up here in a second. Okay. All right. Let me just move that. There we go. So just a little about us, just to start off. Burlington Electric is an over 100-year-old municipal public power electric utility for the city of Burlington. And we are 100% renewable as of 2014, first city in the nation to reach that accomplishment. And we also run energy efficiency programs for the city of Burlington. We're the third largest electric utility in the state of Vermont. We are the largest municipal electric utility in the state. And McNeil, which is the subject of much of our discussion tonight, is operated by Burlington Electric and is the largest power generator in the state of Vermont after Vermont Yankee closed, which was a 620 megawatt nuclear plant in the southern part of the state back almost a decade ago. And as Mark mentioned, Burlington Electric is working with the city departments of the city of Burlington to implement our net zero energy roadmap for 2030, which focuses on reducing and eventually eliminating fossil fuel use for the ground transportation and thermal sectors, one of the most ambitious local climate goals anywhere in the country. So a little more about McNeil. McNeil is jointly owned 50% by Burlington Electric, Green Mountain Power 31%, and Vermont Public Power Supply Authority, which is a group of municipal utilities, 19%. It was built to replace the Moran coal plant, which folks can see or are familiar with, the Moran Frame project down on the waterfront. That used to be the Moran coal plant. Back in the 1970s, Burlington Electric, as an effort to move away from fossil fuel, began co-firing with wood at the Moran plant. And then there was approval by the voters of Burlington to move forward with the McNeil plant, which was built in the 1980s, came online. McNeil is a unique renewable energy asset for us, and we have contracts for wind, solar, hydro, and wood. So we have every different type of renewable generation, either within our portfolio that we own and operate or that we contract for. They all have different attributes and aspects to them. The thing about McNeil that is important from a reliability standpoint is it can store fuel on site and it can be dispatched when we need energy. And that's similar to how some fossil fuel plants can run. Many renewable plants can't operate that way. So when we think about McNeil, the fact that it can dispatch when we need energy, particularly during the winter, when there have been reliability challenges in the region, when prices are very high, that's a benefit to Burlington Electric ratepayers. In terms of the ISO New England grid that we're all connected to, I've pulled the 2022 data, and I'll mention that each of my slides has resources at the bottom where you can click through to links for data and analysis that we're relying on for these slides. So these are posted on our website. If anyone is interested, you can go to the Burlington Electric website. We have a McNeil page, and you can scroll down, and you will see these slides on the top under a new report section 2023. So these are all posted online. So the ISO fuel mix in 2022 was about 54%, a little more than 54% fossil fuel, primarily natural gas. And then we have the remainder being made up of nuclear, only 19% renewable, and that includes large hydropower that's imported into the region. We do not have anywhere close to a 100% clean or 100% renewable grid in New England. Which is an important point that I'll come back to because we have analysis that shows that when McNeil is running, The marginal fuel, the fuel that would replace it if it was offline, is between 92 and 98% of the time natural gas. So if McNeil comes offline, fossil fuel comes back online. I'm going to go ahead here. This is not the subject of tonight's meeting, and I won't linger on it, but for folks who have heard anything about concerns related to health, I share this slide. This is analysis from Jared Ulmer, who is the Climate and Health Program Manager at the Vermont Department of Health, that was presented to the Biomass Task Force of the Vermont Climate Council over the summer. And it says, and this was looking at both McNeil and Rygate, the other wood chip energy plant in the state of Vermont, that looking at the impacts, if any, on health. He said the health impacts caused by air pollution from the two biomass power plants are essentially negligible and thus cannot be elaborated on in any detail. This is mainly a result of the two generating facilities operating with relatively efficient combustion technology and with extensive filtration, pollution controls, and regulations that in combination greatly limit emissions. Again, this is the Vermont Department of Health. Again, I won't linger on that. It's not our topic for this evening. Also, this is not our topic, but I wanted to at least have one slide related to the jobs and economy for McNeil. This analysis is going to be posted this week on our website. Wasn't quite ready yet, but it's analysis from Innovative Natural Resource Solutions, which is a third-party consultant who's done work for us both in 2020 and 2023 as part of our integrated resource plan that we submit to the Public Utility Commission in Vermont. Their analysis shows that McNeil generates on an annual basis over $55 million in economic activity in Vermont. That includes these wood purchases that you can see here on the map in 9 different Vermont counties in 2022, with the largest being in Rutland County and the second largest being right here in Chittenden County. And also jobs, 87 jobs supported by the plant, both at the facility itself and in the supply chain, with total wages of estimated $5.6 million annually. And it notes these jobs are ongoing jobs with a lot of renewable energy. There's construction jobs, but then the operations jobs are fairly limited. These are jobs that continue as long as McNeil continues. Forestry, and I note that on Zoom we have our Chief Forester, Betsy Lesnikoski. She is away on a vacation but is joining us on Zoom, and we have our 3 other professional Vermont licensed foresters in the room here, Seth, Don, and Kevin. Those 3 here and Betsy on Zoom are the 4-person Vermont professional licensed forester team that works uniquely at McNeil to harvest and look at harvesting, look at sustainable monitoring for our forest management. McNeil data here, I want to kind of linger on for a minute because this is an important point. And this is coming from, again, Innovative Natural Resource Solutions report that's posted on our website. It shows that McNeil procures the vast majority of its fuel, 88%, as what is called in-woods chips. And I'm quoting here from, or paraphrasing from the report, that constitutes tops and limbs left over from operations such as lumber and paper making. So 88% are leftover in-woods chips. Another 8% of fuel is mill residue from sawmills. Around 3+% comes from our waste wood yard that we operate at McNeil, where residents can bring clean, untreated waste wood. And then 0.3%, less than 0.5%, is coming from roundwood that is purchased and kept on site in order to be used if we cannot get into the woods during seasons like mud season so that we have some fuel supply. So that's the relative mix. You can see the kind of pie graph there, but this is all kind of written out, and I'll come back to these points in a little bit. I was going to, and let's see if this works, this is just a 1-minute or so video clip from a film series, TV series called Empowered Energy Heroes that we're using with permission from the filmmaker. The narrator here is Dan Riker, who is a former Assistant Secretary of Energy under President Clinton, a former advisor to President Obama, and the former head of climate initiatives at Google. And this is related to McNeil, but also just to carbon accounting relative to biomass generally. So I'm going to press play. Oops. Let's see if we can get this to work. Nope, okay. I might need to unmute myself. Hang on. No. Okay. technical difficulties. This video is on our website as well. The main point, and I'll let it play just for a moment because it shows an illustration that may still be helpful. It's showing essentially, as Dan Riker narrates, that the CO2 that is being used above ground, in the above ground carbon cycle, is being absorbed by trees as they grow. When they fall or when they are cut or used for energy, then that same CO2 is going back into the atmosphere. So it's CO2 that's been above ground, that's coming into a tree, that's going back up into the atmosphere in a cycle, as pointed out here in this circle. Contrast that with CO2 from fossil fuels, which we are extracting, which have been geologically stored for millions of years, have not been part of the above ground carbon cycle, and are being net additions to the carbon cycle that we have. That's the basic point of the video. Dan Riker, who has much more expertise, does a great job of narrating it, so feel free to watch on our website. Apologies that the sound there didn't quite work, but we'll keep moving. The next several slides are direct quotes from various different international, national, and state environmental and climate organizations about the complex topic that we're here to talk about tonight, which is how to account for carbon from bio-related fuels, biomass. How do we look at that? The IPCC quotes here in 2007 and 2019 both speak to sustainable forest management and biomass being part of efforts to lower greenhouse gas emissions to generate the largest sustained mitigation benefit. So that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, 2007 and 2019. Here are a couple different quotes. U.S. Energy Information Administration, burning fossil fuels or biomass releases carbon dioxide. We all know that. However, the plants that are the source of biomass for energy capture almost the same amount of CO2 through photosynthesis while growing as is released when biomass is burned, which can make biomass a carbon-neutral energy source. According to current international convention, IPCC guidelines, carbon released through biomass combustion is excluded from reported energy-related emissions. I'll come back to that point. The White House, under the Obama administration, Council on Environmental Quality. These are guidelines that I'm quoting for the federal government to report its own emissions. And it points out in this quote that we're seeking to avoid double counting. And that's an important point. We cannot count carbon when it is in the land use sector and in the energy sector if it is the same carbon. We have to account for it in one place or another place. And the point that these quotes are all making is we don't account for carbon from biomass in the energy sector emissions. We account for them in what is called the land use or land use change forestry sector emissions. Essentially the flux that's happening within our land use. So if we are losing forests and we are losing carbon in the forests, then that's where this gets accounted for. And likewise, if we're gaining carbon in the forests, then that's showing some sort of a benefit in terms of adding carbon storage. We don't count the stack emissions. It's not that we ignore the stack emissions, but we don't account for them in emissions inventories. So this is IPCC, White House CEQ, U.S. Energy Information Administration. Here is the Obama administration EPA with another quote on a kind of similar, similar line. CO2 emissions from the consumption of fossil fuels will inevitably increase the amount of carbon in the atmosphere on policy-relevant timescales. But such an outcome is not inevitable with the consumption of biologically based feedstocks. Biologically based feedstocks consumed at stationary sources, and McNeil is a stationary source, during a year may be partially or completely balanced by the amount of feedstock that grows during that year. And then lastly, the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, which has an emissions inventory that was just published for 2020 and a methodology document that shows how they come to their conclusions. And so this is quoting the methodologies document from April of 2023, so fairly recently. And it talks about when considering accounting practices for biogenic CO2, carbon emissions from the combustion of fossil fuels are coming from a geologic source, which is on a significantly longer time scale than carbon in the much faster cycle, which moves between pools on the orders of months to centuries, which means combusting fossil fuels adds more carbon that was in long-term storage and effectively out of circulation into the atmosphere and into the more immediate carbon cycle. Carbon dioxide emitted from combustion or decomposition of biogenic materials, which are part of the faster carbon cycle, are assumed to be sequestered by the regrowth of the biogenic material that produced them and are captured in the flux from land use change. So again, we're not accounting for these emissions twice. We're accounting for them in land use change, not at the stack. That's the point here, and that's the point that's made below. So lastly, our own report that just was released, that's again on our website, talking about carbon accounting. I'm not going to linger on this, but it's basically making the point that whether you look at biomass, you can look at it in different ways. Some people look at it as a debt and dividend, and that's not necessarily the right or wrong way, but that's one methodology that some people use. And the point that's being made here in this quote is, given that, remember, 88% of our chips coming from those in-wood chips that are looking at, using tops and limbs, 8% from sawmill residues, et cetera. Given that a significant amount of our chips are what are called here whole tree chips, which are using the tops and branches, that those would even be a carbon-favored fuel under the debt and dividend approach, if somebody adopts that approach. So we've talked just a lot about carbon accounting for biomass. Adam Sherman from VEIC, and VEIC did a report for us that looked at McNeil in 2022. That's on our website as well. And I have some quotes here, one of which that I just want to share. At the landscape level, Vermont's forests grow more new wood each year than is harvested by a 2-to-1 ratio. Based on a 2019 study conducted for the state of Vermont's Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation, analysis that examined FIA data on forest inventory growth, mortality, and wood harvesting levels, Vermont and northern New York forests have been adding forest inventory and stored carbon consistently for decades. So that's the VEIC analysis. Also, here is the quote that I referenced earlier, that when McNeil is not running, the marginal fuel is natural gas 92 to 98% of the time. So that's included here as well. And then there's some data on the methodologies that were used for the VEIC study. A couple other points just beyond the pure carbon accounting, and this is again from the VEIC study, but this is important. McNeil plays a really important role in purchasing a wood from operations that are not going out for the purpose of getting wood chips for energy. These are operations for paper, for a lumber, for different things, and we can provide an economic value to the property owner to keep that land as working land, keep that land continuing to grow trees and sequester and store carbon, as opposed to facing, for example, development pressures. So that's part of the quote here, and the quotes here about the wood products market is, if McNeil wasn't purchasing the wood chips, it's not a given that those properties stay as working lands. It's not a given that they continue to sequester carbon and store carbon in the way that they are. And we know that when our foresters are working with property owners developing forest management plans, they're doing so in a way that helps us continue to have those lands as working lands. We've been to properties in a 30-year span where we went and we've had sustainable management, we've been able to come back and there's a harvest again. So we've seen this cycle, because this is a 40-year-old plant, play out on a decades and decades long time scale. So going to really some of the questions that I think the TEUC has had for us. Again, this is the analysis from Innovative Natural Resource Solutions 2023. This is looking at data, and I know this was one of the questions, is can we have annualized data over a period of years that compares the carbon at the stack and the carbon being stored in the trees, essentially, where McNeil harvests? Can we compare those two things? So this is data, these are the private timberlands in Vermont and New York where McNeil harvests, and it's demonstrating between 2007 and 2020 that there was a net gain of carbon stored in trees in those lands. And when you convert the carbon to CO2, which is the greenhouse gas that we're all concerned about, you get 24.3 million tons of additional forest CO2 between 2007 and 2020. And that's what this graph shows here. So this slide here is taking that value and annualizing it in green, as you can see, and shows our stack emissions. Again, we're not ignoring our stack emissions, they're right here, but it's showing those stack emissions against the forest carbon additions in the areas where we harvest. And I want to make clear, as the quote does as well from the report, McNeil doesn't make a claim against all of those forest carbon additions. Those are not, that's not the point of this. This is a comparative piece using the methodologies that were discussed earlier, saying we're looking at land use flux and land use change. If we are harvesting and losing significant amounts of forest carbon in the areas where we harvest, then that's a challenge from a climate standpoint, in my view. If, on the other hand, we are able to operate a plant like McNeil in these types of areas and still have a significant net gain in terms of forest carbon, then that speaks to a potential benefit. And so that's what this data is demonstrating. looking at it on a one-year basis, just going to 2022. And this includes in orange the plant operations. So that includes some of the upstream emissions that are associated not just with the stack emissions, but let's say diesel that's used for a loader at the plant, for example. So in orange, there's a small slice here that adds to the emissions from the stack. And again, comparing to the annualized forest carbon, and you could see the amount of forest carbon tons, greatly outweighing the individual annualized emissions from McNeil. Moving a little bit to a topic that is related and that really is a critical and important topic for us is district energy. And I want to spend the last few minutes that I have, how am I doing on time? We're doing okay? I want to spend the last few minutes that I have talking about district energy. This is a proximate issue that we have been working on for decades in Burlington, that I've been working on certainly in my 6.5 years at Burlington Electric, and that we are a few months potentially away from having a system that is fully designed and feasible and ready to move forward to potential financing construction with needing a vote from the City Council, needing agreements from customers. So we're not all the way there yet, but this forum, in a way, I think, is aimed at providing information about this project to all of you, to members of the public, to members of the council. So what is district heat? Very simply, district heat is the idea that we can capture additional wasted heat as well as additional steam at McNeil and pipe it underground, either using hot water or in our case, steam, getting it to large customers where they can use it and they can use less fossil fuel. And having multiple customers in a loop, essentially, that are connected to this system. McNeil was designed in its original permit to accommodate district energy. The permit references district energy back in the 80s. And by becoming a district energy plant, McNeil would be a combined heat and power plant. So it's going to have more efficiency compared to today, which is a good thing. District energy is also one of the 4 key pathways that have been identified in our net zero energy roadmap from 2019, which was done by Synapse Energy Economics from Cambridge, Massachusetts. And it's projected to reduce commercial sector natural gas in Burlington by 16%. And folks may see on the news, we had a press event earlier today releasing our 2022 net zero data for the city. And commercial sector natural gas emissions is the one area where we're seeing some rebound relative to the pandemic lows. District heat and the carbon fee policy for buildings and some of the other policies has the opportunity for us to bend that curve back down. And so here, again, we have a link to the Evergreen Energy site. Evergreen Energy is our partner on district heat. I'll touch on that in a moment. This goes through the history, and again, I wasn't kidding. This is, and many of you know this, this is a 40-plus year discussion in the city of Burlington around district heat. We've gone through a variety of iterations. In 2018, 2019, we did have city council approval to file with the PUC to have a locally rate-regulated system here in Burlington, and BED received legislative approval to fund some of the feasibility work related to the current effort. And then this is the current effort with Evergreen Energy. And we have gone through 3 phases of feasibility work all through the pandemic, 2020, 2021, 2022. We have done the design and engineering. Senator Leahy was able to secure before he left office over $5 million in capital funds to support the project. We have a council approval to create a 501c3, which has been done, called Burlington District Energy, that would finance and construct the project. There would be no city debt associated with this project. This would be a nonprofit financed project, not adding to the city's debt burden. We filed the first District Energy Act 250 documents in the history of this project, preliminary documents within the Act 250 permitting process. So all of this is to say this is a very serious effort. I know it's been going on for a long time. I know that some folks at least are disappointed that it hasn't moved forward previously. This effort is pretty close to moving forward, and I wanted to convey that. This is a schematic that I'll walk you through that shows what the developed business model would be for district heat. So the idea is McNeil, using both steam from our boiler as well as a supplementary 100% renewable electric boiler, would provide steam underground and would transfer it to the district energy nonprofit, which would in turn operate the district energy system. The district heat would connect to customers such as the medical center, the university, the Intervale Center, and others. They would receive the physical steam. There would also be a renewable attribute that they could purchase that would be saying, I have purchased not only the physical steam, but I have the environmental attribute. Or other customers can participate by purchasing that attribute as well. So in that sense, local residents, local businesses, the city itself can participate in supporting the project. This is very similar to how we finance and operate community solar projects, for example, in Vermont. So it's that sort of structure that's being contemplated for district heat. Not that we have to linger on this, but this would be the route, essentially, from the plant, which is at the top in the Intervale, and the top would be the north, and coming up to the hospital, and coming through on Mansfield Avenue to Colchester Avenue to the hospital. So just in case you were interested. Several different third-party analyses have been done on district heat. One was the VEIC study that I mentioned. That looked at a little bit of an older version of the project, but still very relevant because it looked at the hospital being a potential customer. It looked at the upstream emissions from McNeil. Those are included here. It looked at the emissions that would be offset in terms of natural gas use. And the VEIC study says you could reduce by over 6,000 tons of CO2 equivalent annually by doing district heat. More current we have, and this is on our website, is what's called a GREET carbon score. Now, this was referenced, I have here the quote, in the newly enacted, over the governor's veto, Affordable Heat Act that just passed this session. That legislation that was passed by the Vermont legislature specifically references using the Argonne National Laboratory GREET model as a way to evaluate clean heat measures. And so what we have is a carbon score under that model conducted by a company called First Environment, commissioned by Vermont Gas. It's not commissioned by BED. That looks at the GREET score for district heat here in Burlington. Again, everything we're talking about, the analyses we've done are related to Vermont, related to McNeil, related to Burlington, or related to the areas in Vermont and New York where we harvest. These are not meta-studies or studies from elsewhere. These are from right here. So this looks exactly at the GREET score for district heat in Burlington, and it finds that it would reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the project, over 95% compared with natural gas. So natural gas has a carbon score on a grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule of energy of 79. So the idea here is to have a common methodology across different energy sources. So it's grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule of energy. And you can see here the McNeil steam has a 3.76 in this analysis, and the electric steam from the electric boiler has a 0.039. But that would not be the primary outlet for district heat, the McNeil steam would. So when you do the runtime and combine those two, it comes out to a 3.6 score for the McNeil steam with the electric boiler. And this is initial modeling and it's draft analysis from First Environment. It's been posted on our website, subject to further revision. But this to me is a significant new study and new development, and it's consistent with the methodology that's been asked for under the State Affordable Heat Act and consistent with what the Public Utility Commission has asked for these types of projects as well. And then just lastly, from Evergreen's own analysis, just to kind of finalize the district heat discussion, we'd be talking about 190,000 MMBTU per year of renewable thermal steam that would be delivered through the project. You would also achieve an efficiency at the customer site of 34,000 MMBTU of saved energy. So that's your two totals, and that's how you get to more than a 16% reduction in the commercial natural gas related emissions in Burlington. I have shared a lot with you. I know these are very dense slides. I typically like to have slides with more graphs and more visuals. These are going to live on our website. These are cited. These are meant to be a resource for folks who want to look at the analysis that we've shared and review it for themselves. So I really appreciate the time. I know we'll have a chance to perhaps answer questions or provide more comments as we go forward. But I want to stop there and thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you all for your time and listening to the presentation.
Thank you, Darren. And also the materials that are presented tonight, we're going to make an effort to make sure that's all on the TEUC website under this agenda item as well. So it'll be a living document that we can use to refer to as we have this community discussion going forward. Next up, we have Professor Rooney Varga and Professor Muma who are going to present next. When you're ready.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. All right. Can you hear me? Great.
Yes, can you hear?
Yes? Okay.
Good.
All right, one moment. Let me just get my screen shared. Okay. And then let's do that. Okay, great. I guess I'll just start off by saying it is really an honor to be here today. It's great to hear about what's happening here in Burlington as an outsider, as somebody who's coming from Massachusetts. I have to admit I'm a little bit jealous. I was driving up today thinking, how much I miss being in northern New England and how much I love being here. I live in Somerville, which is a very densely populated part of Metro Boston, and I really love being up here, and it's truly an honor to share our little bit of wisdom with you and to hopefully help you make an effective decision. I also just want to take a moment to say also, I really applaud Burlington. It's so wonderful to see so many people here concerned about this kind of in the weeds issue. That's not always easy to understand. And also applaud Burlington for its climate ambition and climate action. It's truly an inspiration. So Bill and and I'll hand it off to Bill, and then we'll kind of do a little back and forth.
Good. Yes, I'd just like to echo what Juliet just said. I actually live in northwestern Massachusetts in Williamstown. My northern property boundary is Pownell, Vermont. So I almost am in Vermont, but not quite. Let me just begin by saying what we want to do is to share with you the information that has occurred mostly in the last 5 or 6 years, including that from the most recent IPCC report. By the way, I was an author of the 2007 report, and there's actually more in there than you revealed, which is that energy has three qualities to it. It can be renewable, it can be efficient, and it can be high or low carbon. And in that, we specifically pointed out that burning wood is very slowly renewable, and it is very high carbon. So those are just facts that we have to deal with. We all know that climate has changed, and I won't go through each one of these. The one on the upper right was a picture taken in New York just last week when the smoke from the fires were there. And it wasn't that climate change caused the fire in Quebec, but it certainly made it much more intense than it would have otherwise been. And if we look at the changes, the damage that's caused by climate change, that's increasing incredibly over the years. And the reason for that, of course, is that the Earth has gotten warmer. The other thing that is not always appreciated, the Earth has not gotten warmer uniformly. The Arctic is warming of something like 4 times faster than the Earth as a whole, and that's changing the whole dynamics of the jet stream, the polar vortex that normally keeps cold air in the Arctic, and we're also just getting reports that the same thing is happening with oceans. The currents in the oceans are changing in ways that are going to be affecting us in pretty grim ways. This is just showing, since we've had temperature records, the rise in carbon dioxide, which is shown in the red here on the right. And these are the average temperatures for the year. In every year, they go up and down. The ups are mostly El Nino years, and we can see that there's a pretty good correlation between that. We've added more gases to the atmosphere that absorb more radiant heat from the Earth and radiate it back to Earth instead of letting it radiate out to space. So the Quebec wildfires, that really got everybody's attention. The question is, what happened to the CO2 from that? And well, we know the smoke and particulates made it all the way to New York City, but what happened to the carbon dioxide? And you heard something about a fast carbon cycle and a slow carbon cycle. That's been talked about, but there's really only one carbon cycle. In fact, if we look at this, whether it's a fire in Quebec, the bottom one, or from the McNeil plant in the middle, or from fossil fuels at the top, they all go into the atmosphere, and it's allocated in this proportion. 48% in any given year net. This is the net increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so less than half of the increase in the atmosphere is less than half of what we put in from all these different sources. and about a quarter of it goes into the ocean, and more than a quarter of it goes into the forests. And the point is that forest and ocean carbon dioxide removal does not privilege carbon dioxide from wood burning or from power stations over fossil fuels. It treats them all equally. There is not a tree I have ever met that could tell whether a carbon dioxide molecule came from burning wood or burning coal, right? It just doesn't work that way. So it's really a single thing, and that's the way it is treated. We know that the forest carbon, if it's burned, as it's shown here at the bottom, or if it goes to McNeil, it's burned, and we know that that if there's less of that than the forest is growing, then we have just as you showed, and as you correctly pointed out, it's not because you're harvesting that those trees are growing that way. You're getting more forest growth there. It's just that you're harvesting less than the forest growth. And if those trees were not harvested, the growth would be even greater, and the carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere would be greater. So this is the way in which the scientific community analyzes the carbon cycle. And you can see over here, this is the emission from fossil fuels, and it's 35 billion tons a year. And this is the emission from the land, which includes fires and land use change from the loss of forest to development and so forth. And that's 5, so the total is about 40 billion tons between what we emit from fossil fuels and from the land. And yet the increase is only 19. Now that's just almost miraculous, because about 20 billion is being removed by the land and by the oceans. So that's all in a single cycle. Now, what are we going to do about climate change? Well, governments decided in 2015 we should not let the temperature rise before 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, because it causes irreversible change. How do we avoid this? And so governments went to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, said, pray, dear scientists, tell us, how do we keep the temperature from rising more than 1.5 degrees Celsius? And in a special report, they concluded, to keep the temperatures from rising above 1.5 degrees Celsius, global net anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions must decline by about 45% from 2005 levels by 2030, reaching net zero around 2050, and then be net negative from there beyond 2100. So we hear about net zero as though it's something we can get done today. We can't. This is in order to keep the temperature from rising, we basically have to not let the temperature or the concentrations rise in the atmosphere much further. So there are two different roles for forests. The traditional one is that forests were removed to make way for farms and urban development. They provided materials for buildings and fuel for energy. And today, the U.S. Forest Service classifies 97% of all forests in Vermont as timberlands, which means they're suitable for producing timber. But they are also a critical component of the Earth's operating systems. They absorb, as we saw, about 29% of all fossil fuel emissions. They store not only fuel emission, but all these emissions. They store approximately as much carbon in the trees and soils as is in the atmosphere. If managed differently, they might store twice as much carbon. And this is a point that we have to realize. We could be getting more out of these amazing forests that we have if we manage them differently. And this study that came out in 2018 estimated that we could store twice as much if we manage them for that purpose. And in the internationally agreed climate goals, this is the point that's often overlooked. It is to achieve concentrations of the greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, in the atmosphere that will avoid dangerous interference with the climate system. So it's the amount in the atmosphere that's important. And we often talk about it in terms of emissions and removals. That's just the way of getting it there or taking it out. And in 2015, they came up with this whole business about keeping it below 1.5 degrees. And they said should do everything we do also to take it out by forests. And by the way, global temperatures have already risen by 1.2 degrees Celsius, and we're trying to hold it below 1.5. As a scientist, I can tell you we're not going to succeed at that. We are not going to succeed at that. We have not come close to reducing our emissions by 45% by 2030. We just can't possibly get there from here. But let's do everything we can to get it as low as possible, as quickly as possible. So in the updated IPCC report that just came out last year, it says that safeguarding biodiversity and ecosystems is fundamental to climate resilient development with very high confidence. This is the first time the IPCC has said anything about the natural world, other than that it was there and it was taking out carbon dioxide. Maintaining the resilience of biodiversity and ecosystem services at a global scale depends on effective and equitable conservation of approximately 30 to 50% of Earth's land, freshwater, and ocean areas, including currently near natural ecosystems. What that means is, we're not here to tell you that there shouldn't be a forestry industry. Let's just say there can be a forestry industry on the other half. But we can't do both of them at the same time, in the same places, most of the time. The summary for policymakers, that's what that's from. And then there was this other statement which really surprised me. It is also the case that protection of existing natural forest ecosystems is the highest priority for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And that refers to a paper that I and colleagues published in 2019. And you can find it at this site. And the reason for that is that if by managing our forests sustainably, we have kept them all at a much younger age and much smaller size than some of them would get if they were allowed to keep growing. And we'll take a look at some of those factors in a moment. So, so we need to move it up. Oh, closer to the mic. All right. Now, the combustion of biomass generates about emission. Is that better? Okay, good. Roughly equivalent to the combustion of fossil fuels. And as you heard correctly, the counting system says we don't count them at the stack, but we count them as removing carbon from the land. And both of those are important. If you have removed it, in other words, carbon that was stored in a forest is no longer stored in that forest. And therefore, we're not in as good a shape as we were before. And it's sort of an artifice of the system to say we don't want to count it twice, so we just arbitrarily chose to count it as a land factor rather than a stack factor. But where do you get the number from? From the stack, because that's what you can measure exactly. You can't measure it on the land. And the report goes on to say the neutrality perception is linked to a misunderstanding of the guidelines for greenhouse gas inventories. In the specific case of existing forests that may continue to grow if not used for bioenergy, some studies employing counterfactual baselines show that forest bioenergy systems can temporarily have higher cumulative carbon dioxide emissions than a fossil reference system. In other words, it can be worse than burning a fossil fuel. And I think that's important to recognize because it is the removal, the trees that are cut are no longer removing carbon dioxide. That needs to be put into the equation. Or they're not storing it, and they're not removing additional. And they're not accumulating more, and they're not getting to where they could be. So let me just turn it over to Juliet here for the next phase.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Bill. Can you all hear me okay? Okay. Let me see if,
that way,
yeah,
just a little bit.
Adjust a little bit here. Okay, so what I'd like to do, in order to answer the questions about McNeil and about whether or not, really fundamentally, what makes sense for the future of McNeil in order to ensure that Burlington meets its climate goals and climate commitments, I thought I would share with you a little bit, again, kind of framing the context in terms of carbon budget, where we are versus really a very different time, which was when the decision was first made to build McNeil in 1978, and when McNeil first started operating in 1984 versus today, where we are in terms of our climate crisis, our carbon budget, and also our climate goals are very different. So if we look at kind of that context first, here we are out to 1984. These are CO2 emissions in gigatons or billions of tons per year from 1900 out to that time when McNeil first started operating, so 6 years after the decision was made. And I just ran a little model and calculation to take a look at, in order to meet our current understanding of the remaining carbon budget, in other words, how much more carbon we can put in the atmosphere and still have a 50-50 chance of staying under or within that 1.5 degrees C target. And this kind of hurts to say this. I'm a mom of 3 kids, and that's really the reason I'm here tonight, honestly, is if we had started doing this when I was a kid, if we had had this meeting and this conversation, we could have flatlined our emissions in 1984, and we still would have been easily under the 1.5 C degree carbon budget and not had to start cutting emissions until well after 2050. Instead, sadly, we did this. Our emissions continued to rise, and now, not even according to the 1.5 degrees C budget, according to your goals here in Burlington and Vermont, we have my understanding is a net zero goal by 2050. So if we really understand what net zero means, it basically means zero. And that means an emissions curve reducing like this red line. In reality, sadly, because emissions have continued to rise in the last few years and our understanding of the limitations of that 1.5 degrees C budget have also improved, it's actually worse. It's actually more like a 2037 zero goal. So that's pretty tough. It's a steep, really, when I think about my kids, I think about we're kind of in an emergency here. Like, we need to cut emissions as quickly as possible. Okay, so why am I bringing this up? I'm bringing this up because, I'll give one more background context before I kind of dive in, I guess. So another thing that we've heard about today is that the forests are growing in Vermont, landscape carbon is accumulating in Vermont. This is actually an image that Bill shared with me of carbon density. So if you look at it's a little bit hard to see, but if you look at the color scale there, you can see what that represents is metric tons of carbon per hectare in the northeast forest. So pink is a low number. And we know that 95% of New England forests are less than 100 years old. Much of the area, we think, where McNeil is getting its wood from has potential to grow substantially more. And New England forests could continue to accumulate additional carbon for more than 100 years. So if we think back, right, we're starting from a situation where European settlers came here a couple hundred years ago, and at that time, they denuded the landscape. We ended up with about 15% forest coverage. Now we're at about 85%. So you could say that we're still repaying the carbon debt of those original settlers, okay? And the good news is that the trees are doing that for us, right? The carbon is accumulating in those trees. Okay, so back to our context, yesterday versus today. That, if only I had a time turner to go back to 1984, we were looking at a stable climate. The impacts of climate change were uncertain. They were far in the future. Think about the discourse. There was no discourse about climate change. We were worried about peak oil, right? There really wasn't widely available and affordable zero carbon energy like we have today. I just drove our Bolt up. I stole it from my kids. I charged it at a renewable energy outlet. At least that's what it said to me. I don't always believe these things. But we have now, right, solar, wind, hydro, and most importantly, the cheapest form of energy, the most abundant form of energy is energy efficiency. The energy we don't use. It is widely available. So back in 1984, it made a lot of sense to have a counterfactual. In other words, if we're not using wood, what are we doing? If we're not using wood, we're burning fossil fuels. But today, warming is accelerating. We're not in the new normal. We're in an accelerating pace of change, right? It's like we're seeing this now, and unfortunately with El Nino here, we're going to see it even worse in the next couple of years. We need to have immediate and steep cuts in carbon emissions, and in fact, we have legally binding goals to achieve those things. But the good news is that not only is zero carbon energy far more accessible and affordable, but it comes with a whole climate tech economy, jobs and opportunity. And now, the appropriate counterfactual is not continued use of fossil fuels. I think we all agree, right? The appropriate counterfactual is rapid transition to zero carbon energy and let our forests grow. Because what we need to do, is transfer carbon from the atmosphere to our forests. And I'm gonna just, again, as a mom, I'm gonna use this really simple tool that my kids get really clearly, but actually it's basically says exactly the same thing that our complex dynamic computer model that we published in peer-reviewed papers you can check out also says, which is that carbon behaves according to the laws of conservation of mass. Whether you can see it, smell it, or not, we can't see or smell carbon dioxide without instruments, but it still behaves according to the laws of conservation of mass. So if you think about the water in this cup as carbon in the atmosphere, and we have a finite atmosphere and water, and carbon accumulates in it, if we emit carbon to it, I think we all are on the same page about that. If I have water in this cup representing carbon in our forests, I don't think it takes that, it's not that hard to get, that if I harvest and burn the wood, I'm doing this. And carbon is accumulating in the forest as a result. Now, we've heard that carbon is also accumulating in the landscape. That would be this, right? And we can argue, we can argue a lot about the details of how fast those flows are happening, what is driving them, what the counterfactual is, et cetera. That's where the complexity is in this question about biomass. But what I want to argue here today is that the fundamental counterfactual that we should be addressing is that, well, we have an opportunity to let our forests grow, which does this, and ends up with less carbon in the atmosphere. And also I want to just mention that we need to be careful about what we're giving biomass credit for. In other words, does it make sense to assume that it is because we're harvesting wood and transferring it to the atmosphere that landscape carbon is going up in the forests of Vermont, or does that not make sense to get credit for? And that gets back at that fundamental question of where do we account for carbon? We don't want to double count it. Should it be in land use, or should it be in emissions associated with energy, which is what we're using it for? Okay, so now I'm going to get into, okay.
Takes time away.
So I want to just get into the model. I'm not going to bore you with, calculus equations and whatever else, but I just want to give you kind of the overview of what we modeled. And I'm happy to share with you, dive into the nuts and bolts in more detail if you want to afterwards. Okay, so fundamentally, and I don't think any of us are in disagreement about this, when we harvest and burn wood for energy, there are fossil fuel emissions associated with that activity, right? We all agree about that. And you could argue that that should be accounted for in transportation or whatever other sector you want to account it for in. I know at McNeil you do account for fossil fuel emissions associated with wood, which makes sense because you wouldn't be doing that fossil fuel activity if it weren't for needing to burn the wood. So we have fossil fuel emissions associated with harvest, transport, processing, and potentially transport. Again, it depends on the details. That all, as we've already talked about, ends up with transferring from fossil fuels carbon into the atmosphere. We also have, of course, burning of the wood itself, which leads to carbon emissions at the stack, which, as we talked about already, the case was made that it doesn't make sense to count that at the stack. I don't know, we conserve carbon associated with a pulse of use of bioenergy, and we count that not in land use, but at the stack, so we're not double counting it. And there is also carbon leaking from those ecosystems as you cut trees or remove trees. You have organic carbon that the soil warms and respiration occurs and carbon leaks from the soils. Counterbalancing that is carbon that's taken up by forests that regrow, right? It's that thing that happens afterwards. So you harvest, and then the forest regrows. Okay, so again, looking at this idea of how do we dynamically account for carbon, I want to show you what our models show if you just take a pulse of bioenergy. And what this y-axis shows you is the percent of the original carbon in biomass. Okay, so we're starting off with a New England maple beech birch forest, like you have in the hardwoods around here, that are about 100 years old, that could continue to grow if it were left alone. And that's why you see here, this no harvest line shows that it does continue to grow. It adds more carbon as it grows. I'm showing here now a pulse that results from a 25% harvest or 25% thinning versus a 95% thinning. And I'm not at all saying that McNeil is doing the 95% thinning. We could argue about this. But the point is that there's some harvest that's happening, and as a result of that harvest, you get a decline in carbon in the forest biomass, right? It's just this piece here. And then it takes time, but then you see that the forest regrows, and that's that carbon coming back into the forest, accumulating back. Okay, but look at this axis. Here we're down at 2023, so it's today. We have use of bioenergy in 2023, so carbon immediately goes down in the forest. And I just want to point out that it's the area under these curves that represents the net carbon that's transferred from the forest to the atmosphere, right? So we're all on the same page. This is not net zero, okay? This is net transfer to the atmosphere. We would need to get way past 2050 to get to net zero. So you could ask, well, don't the thinned forests grow faster, okay? So here, this black line that you see, right? That's just the tangent there, and I'm already hearing my son who's taking, multivariate calculus yelling at me, well, you should have taken it from here, right? So no, it's just taking it as a random example. Here are some different, I could take it anywhere, but here I'm taking a tangent there to show the slope of the line. The slope is going to be the percent or the amount of carbon fixed per year. The amount of carbon going back into, that's the flow, right? That's this. So the slope of the line shows how fast it is. Yes, the slope of the line is steeper, showing faster growth for the harvested forests. I'm not at all arguing with that. That's not what matters. What matters is, where is the carbon? Is it in the forest or is it in the atmosphere? And the problem is that it's in the atmosphere. Okay, well, we get back to this question, well, if we weren't burning wood at McNeil, would we be burning gas? So if we take a look at this question of, is it better than burning gas? Sadly, the answer over any time that's relevant to the policy we're talking about is no. If we have, so on the y-axis here, what you see is the percent of emitted carbon that remains in the atmosphere, okay? So if I start off at my 2023 pulse, and here I've got a case of the 100% shows what happens if wood displaces zero carbon energy, like energy efficiency, solar, wind, or hydro. with a 25% harvest or a 95% harvest. And the bottom line shows what happens if wood displaces gas. So, in other words, gas is emitting, we're accounting for that by this difference between the zero carbon and the gas scenario. But in both cases, whether I have this black line coming from here, so if I'm displacing zero carbon energy, I actually end up with a situation where I'm pretty close to 100%. So this 25% harvest is about 96% in 2050 of the original carbon emitted is still there. If I compare it against gas, it's a little bit better. I'm more at like 75%. But still, we're not anywhere close to net zero. Okay, and I know that our model is looking at, not just residues, but at thinning of trees as well. And so I just want to point out that while I don't have that modeled precisely, we do have carbon payback time. So research showing that carbon payback times for burning residues is years to decades compared to decomposition. And that there are economically attractive counterfactuals. So you could instead use that carbon for building materials or other materials instead of burning them. Insulation, for example. I haven't been involved in all of the hard work that's been done to plan for this potential steam line. I'm fully acknowledging that I'm working from limited access to information and not having, but I think the key point is like this key question about whether it makes sense to invest in the steam line or district heat, whatever you want to call it. Do we end up with a better situation or a worse situation? I guess that's the fundamental question. We know that fossil emissions from wood harvest, processing, and transport would add about 16,393 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. But the emissions at the stack would be far more. And please forgive me, this is not from the additional investment. This is from current activities. Please forgive me, I was jumping ahead to another slide. So this slide refers to the difference between emissions that are currently counted at McNeil versus the emissions that are not counted directly, but that are coming out of the stack. Okay, but before I wrap up and ask the question about investing further in McNeil, I want to share with you one more analysis from our work with model-based analyses. And what this graph shows is basically a run that we did where we looked at this question of what would happen if you have a pulse of carbon dioxide emissions from whatever source, wood, fossil, whatever you want to burn, for 20 years, followed by another 20-year period where every single molecule of CO2 is sequestered back out of the atmosphere. So this is perfect sequestration in a short time period, even when you think about something like residues. The resulting carbon dioxide slowly, you have a pulse of emissions. The carbon dioxide in the atmosphere builds over time until the emissions go negative, at which point it starts to drop. But because of the time that it takes for heat to accumulate in our climate system, and especially our oceans, where 93% of the heat that's accumulated so far currently is, and the time that it takes to dissipate that heat, it is centuries before the heat from that pulse of carbon and subsequent sequestration of that carbon dissipates. In other words, you are warming the climate for centuries, even if you sequester every molecule within a 20-year period. What does that mean? It means that delayed carbon neutrality, in other words, waiting for the trees to grow back, is not climate neutral. And it also means that in the interim, climate damage that happens because of that worsened climate change during that temporary, if only centuries long period of time, is not reversed, right? The houses that are damaged by intense storms, the wildfires that happen, the glaciers that melt, the sea level that rises, does not magically like go backwards, right? It still happened, even if every molecule of CO2 is sequestered. Okay, so now to get to the thing that I don't, that this idea of do we invest more in McNeil or not? Do we expand the use of bioenergy in Burlington or not? Our best estimate was that additional biogenic emissions from that investment would be, not massive, but would be certainly additional and substantial, on the order of 15,000 tons per year. So that would both increase the use of emissions and increase wood bioenergy, but also maybe more importantly, we can argue about these numbers, it would prolong Burlington's commitment to this plant. It would invest in keeping this plant going. And I think that is a risky proposition for a city that is committed to climate action, and also in a changing policy environment. We know that Massachusetts, for example, as we'll mention in a bit, has passed a new law that takes wood bioenergy out of the renewable portfolio standard. You can't count it as renewable or as zero carbon anymore in Massachusetts. So is Vermont likely to follow? I would wager yes. And then also, I just want to point out that, this again is our model-based analysis. It's from a national level, so I fully acknowledge that. But it's again down to this simple system. If I continue to, harvest and burn, right? That's what I'm growing the use of bioenergy. If I do that faster than I can pay it back, what I'm doing basically is paying for credit card debt with a credit card, right? And you end up continuing to accrue carbon in the atmosphere. So I think the problem is, again, thinking back to 1978, 1994, it would have been okay to have some use of wood going on for a while. We had more time then. Now the problem is we're talking about increasing the use of bioenergy and continuing to accrue that carbon debt that's going to put us in a hole that we don't want to be in. So again, I think just a warning from down south, and I hope you're going to let me back up here. We have this changing policy context. Policymakers are starting to understand this is a new climate reality that we live in. And we don't have wood in our RPS in Massachusetts anymore.
So there are no subsidies.
And yeah, there are no subsidies, no RECs. Hand it back over to Bill.
One of the things that we've come to realize just literally since the about 2015 or so, 2014 actually, is the importance of very large trees in forests. And a colleague of mine, Bob Leverett, who actually goes out and measures trees, he doesn't just use the models and so forth. He goes out. In his younger days, he used to climb to the top of a 170-foot tree and drop a measuring tape down. He doesn't do that anymore. But he uses laser rangefinders to do this work. And at the request of a town in Massachusetts where there was a big debate going on, they wanted to cut down some big old trees, and they said, "Oh, don't worry, we'll plant another one in its place. Oh, we'll plant 2. We'll plant 10. How's that?" And so people said, "Bob, what does that mean?" So this is on the left. This is a 150-year-old mature red oak, and it stores about 8 tons of carbon. And the question is, if you had younger trees that were 50 feet tall, this is 100 feet tall and 54 inches in diameter. If it was 50 feet tall, how many trees of that size would it take to store 8 tons of carbon? And the answer is 35. Then if you look at street trees that are 40 feet tall, it would take 151 of those. They're only 16 years old. And if you got them straight for landscaping at 25 feet tall, 4 inches in diameter, it'd be 465. I mean, it's just is this whole business of well, we're going to cut down big trees and replace them with faster growing little trees makes no sense at all. It is absolutely destroying the forest and its carbon capacity. And remember, it's the amount that's stored. And we did a study, and okay, it wasn't here, it was out in the Pacific Northwest, all the national forests in Oregon, and it turned out that they had not cut any trees bigger than 21 inches in diameter back in the 1990s in order to save the spotted owl. Lo and behold, they decided at the end of the Trump administration to get rid of that rule. And so a young scientist came to a group of us older scientists and said, I found a data set of the Forest Service that has measurements of 700,000 trees in those forests. How much carbon is in those greater than 21-inch trees? Turned out it was only 3% of the trees, but they held 42% of the carbon. That's pretty astounding. And in study after study, we're seeing the same sort of thing. So this is an important thing to remember. Managing it sustainably for logging keeps the trees young and relatively small. And so we don't get the big trees that really accumulate the carbon. That's why I think we need to have some forests set aside, and maybe this initiative by President Biden to mature and old growth trees is the way to do this. And we'll start with federal lands and public lands, and then we may find people in private lands who'd like to help and do the same thing. This does not put an end to forestry. It just says it can't be done everywhere. So here's just a big tree. This is a tree that's storing about 8 or 9 tons of carbon. It's half the weight of the wood is carbon. And so to get that, got to let them grow. And this term that we introduced, which has caused great consternation in the forestry world, there's deforestation where you undo a forest. There's reforestation where you replant an undone forest. And there's afforestation where you plant trees somewhere else that wasn't a forest. But there was no term for allowing this any existing forest to keep growing, to take advantage of the fact that they would produce these very large trees storing great amounts of carbon. We use the term proforestation. A lot of people in the forestry industry don't like it. Let me just say right now, I never intended it to mean we should never cut down another tree. It just meant that we should allow more trees to continue growing in order to really accumulate the great amount of carbon that they're capable of. So it's all stored in their limbs and in other places, the soils. Until only 20 years ago, we had no idea what all those fungi in the soils were doing. It turns out they're a huge carbon storage, and they're a system of sharing nutrients among trees, making them actually grow better, faster, larger. I'm just going to close, and I'm just going to read the statement in each of these. I'll just give you 4 examples of some of this recent research. This blockbuster paper in 2018 in the journal Nature, which is one of the most prestigious journals there is, by Jim Lutz and about 50 co-authors, studied 48 forests around the world of all types. They found the largest 1% of trees, those greater than about 3/8 of an inch in diameter, comprised half of the above ground living carbon. In other words, 1 out of every 100 trees, the biggest one out of every 100 trees, held half the carbon. There's one of those forests was Harvard Forest here in New England. Interestingly enough, the largest 1% only held 30% of the carbon. The reason is New England forests are still recovering from the decimation that took place in the 19th century. So interesting. Richard Birdsey just published in January this paper, just found that forests in the later stages of their development played this outsized role in the accumulation and long-term storage of atmospheric carbon, and subsequently enabling their protection where lacking has been recognized an effective nature-based solution. So that was looked at all the national forests in the whole country, including Green Mountain. Here are just two other papers. The paper that was referred to by Stevenson, they measured 403 tropical and temperate tree species, showing that for most species, mass growth rate increases continuously with tree size. In other words, the amount of carbon that's accumulated just keeps increasing as trees get bigger and bigger. And then there's the paper that I published with co-authors, which simply said that growing existing forests intact to their ecological potential, termed proforestation, is a more effective, immediate, and low-cost approach that could be immobilized across suitable forests of all types. And again, this is not saying how we manage all forests. We have need for forest products, and we'll continue to have need for forest products. And we can manage forests sustainably with even less carbon loss than we have today by making better use, non-combustion use, of the now residuals, the tops, the branches, and so forth. And so I think that this is just, we really need to work together on this. And I'll turn it back to Juliet.
Just to sum up, I mean, I think we recommend that wood bioenergy emissions are counted at the stack. That it makes sense to not invest more in continued use of bioenergy, or at least from wood, and certainly not growing that investment because it's risky. It makes sense to create strategic forest carbon reserves, as Bill is talking about, to support forest growth and proforestation. And we recognize the need to incentivize private landowners to preserve forests for long-term accumulation of carbon, and that you need to compensate people to do that. So I think that's all we have to share tonight, and happy to field any questions, although I guess maybe that's at the end. Okay, yeah.
Thank you. Next, I wanted to allow our other panelists, Dr. Kosiba, Adam Sherman, and Harris Rohn, to offer any of their thoughts on the TEUC prompts. So in any particular order, go ahead.
Okay, there we go. Well, I guess I'll sort of maybe just also comment on sort of the presentation. So I am a forest ecologist, so I'm really speaking for my deep knowledge of Vermont's forests here and in the region. I spend a lot of time out on private lands and public lands, state lands, and lands managed by conservation organizations. And, definitely we're in a climate crisis. I'm deeply concerned with where we are right now, and that we haven't, as a world, made better strides to reduce fossil fuel use. It's really frustrating that we've come to this point. And we are also pointed out in a biodiversity crisis. But one thing that I really get concerned with, and it happens in our state accounting, we don't account for all of our imports. And this is something we don't do here in Vermont, we don't do in Massachusetts. And it's really concerning because there is a really easy way for us to push our impacts elsewhere and outsource our resource demands. And that's, climate change, that's one of the reasons we're there, is not really paying the full price for all of our needs and resource demands and how we work and live in this world. And so, for example, here in Vermont, we harvest about 90% of the wood that we use. And that's great, right? We have this great, amazing resource, covers about 4.5 million acres of forest. In Massachusetts, where they also have a lot of forests, it's 2%. They are harvesting 2% of the wood they use. That means 89% are coming from elsewhere. That might mean plantations, that might mean the Amazon, that might mean lots of different things that's out of sight, out of mind, and I think that's a really big concern for me. And so in my work, a lot of what I do is how can we manage forests better, right? How can we leave big trees? So I talk to foresters about that, talk to landowners, right? I think there is a way that we can do both, and I will say for, biomass, we're there harvesting other wood products, and biomass is usually an added thing that makes it profitable, because this is a thing, wood is actually not that profitable. And so to actually get some of this work to happen in the woods, you have to pay a logger and a forester and a trucker to get the materials. And so that biomass can be that little bit extra that allows the work to happen. I look around this building, I see a lot of carbon being stored, right? That's wood products. We have needs, we have resource demands. How can we do that in a sustainable way in our forest that values all of our forests? And, thinking about what we love about this state, it's mostly the forest, right? When we look out on our green mountains. And so we have to really think carefully about how to keep that land forested. Right now in our state, we're losing about 14,000 acres of forest land a year, mostly to housing, and it's not usually sustainable, like affordable housing units. It's usually big houses out in the woods. And as we've seen this in other places in the country, there's been lots of studies, when logging is not feasible economically or when there's a lot of barriers politically, land is easier, it sells, it parcels, and we're seeing this. Our parcels are getting smaller, we're having our forests fragmented, we're losing our forest cover, and to me that's a really big concern. And so, valuing all the parts of our forest and all the services, including the amazing service of carbon sequestration and storage, but also all the other benefits our forests provide, I think, is a really nuanced and complex discussion that we need to keep in the back of our minds. So that's one of my big concerns, is the easy thing we can do of pushing some of our impacts elsewhere, but also making sure we're keeping our forest land forest. And I think that's sort of all I'm going to say right now. I'll pass it on.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Adam Sherman, and I was part of the 2022 study that looked at the carbon impacts of the McNeil generating station. Darren covered all the methodology and the background and the results. I think there's I'm delighted to be here and to have the opportunity to talk about the pros and cons of where our energy comes from. And the fact that we have a local energy source, we're making our electrons locally, I think it's a privilege to be able to, have an open conversation and exploration and debate about the merits of that. As Ali alluded to, when our resources, including our energy, come from further away, it's out of sight, out of mind, and I think we have the honor and privilege to be here, having this conversation. I think these same debates play out in any energy generation source, whether it be solar or battery and mining cobalt. So I think there are a lot of parallels here, and there are no perfect solutions. I think wood energy is a tool in the toolbox, and the scale of our climate challenge requires every tool in the toolbox moving forward. And so there are no silver bullet energy choices, but we can use pieces of silver buckshot to cobble together and move quickly to displace fossil fuels. There was a lot of kind of discussion around the carbon frameworks, and I just wanted to mention that a lot of times people get really hung up on why one scientific paper says, wood energy is great, and another one says it's worse than coal. And the thing to remember about carbon accounting is that it is an accounting framework, and that the researchers choose the boundaries of that analysis. So if you only look at a single stand that was harvested and there was 100 tons of carbon inventory in that stand, and it was brought down to, say, 50 tons, and you're looking at that time frame to regrow, that's a stand level analysis. And so oftentimes the narrower boundaries of the accounting studies are the biggest predeterminant of the conclusions of the study. So when you have narrow focused boundaries, you tend to paint a picture that is not favorable for wood energy in general. Studies that have taken a broader and wider framework and boundary of their analysis, looking at the fossil fuel displacement of wood energy, tend to have more favorable outcomes. So just in terms of reconciling, like why does one study say, this is great, and another study say it's bad? I think it's really important to look at. The other thing to keep in mind is that landscape level framework. So if you zoom out from one parcel of or plot of forest land that is harvested, for every 1 acre that is harvested, in Vermont we have 4.5 million acres of forest land. And for every 1 acre that's harvested, you have dozens of other acres that are part of the management system, part of that wood basket. And the growth of new wood on those parcels that in that given year aren't being harvested are balancing out. So I think that's really important to look at not just the time scale of the accounting frameworks, but the spatial scale or the landscape scale of this. And I'll pause it there and turn it over to Harris.
Thanks, Adam. My name's Harris Rowan. I'm a forester, and I live in Burlington. I'm a Burlington resident, so I recognize a lot of people here. And I'll try to keep this short. I'm not a carbon accounting expert like some of the other people here, but I do manage properties in Vermont, all over northern Vermont, and I appreciate the comment from Professor Mumau that what I'm saying is that we shouldn't harvest. What I'm saying is that we shouldn't harvest. There just should be some areas maybe that we shouldn't, and I would agree with that. So I just want to give an example maybe of how harvesting can, over time, improve all the things that you mentioned: the biodiversity, the carbon storage, the sequestration. The old growth, and the example I'll give is, I don't know, a few years ago was a stand of pine trees that were coming up from an old agricultural field 100 years ago maybe, that was abandoned, is coming up to this pine. There, you could see they were dying, there were some holes in there that were, going to just expand over the time, and it was going to die. You have some beautiful hardwoods coming up underneath it. And so you could see what was going to happen in maybe another 50 years or so. Those pines were going to die, the hardwoods are going to come in and take over and use that site much better. What I did with working with the landowner and writing a management plan and working with McNeil to get it approved and all that is to take out that pine, so kind of move forward what might have happened in 50 or 75 years, make that happen in 20 years, that those hardwoods would be growing in better and using that site better, and shipping that wood, some of the wood, not, we utilize the saw logs, we utilize the firewood, but the stuff that's lower quality than that, ship it to McNeil and keep the lights on here. So I really don't see what's wrong with that. It's an abundant, local, renewable resource. More of it's growing than it's being cut. I just don't see the problem. I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you to all our panelists for those opening remarks on the TEUC prompts. We're going to go next to a short 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and have some more Q&A. Seats, please. We're trying to do too much with too little time, I know.
What's that?
We're trying to do too much with too little time.
3 hours. Here, you want me to?
I'm gonna,
Okay.
I told everybody to sit down.
Yikes. All right.
Okay, everybody, we're gonna get going again. Thanks.
Sure. Why not? I think acknowledge that, we're trying to do a lot.
Yep. I know we're trying to do a lot in a short amount of time tonight, so we're gonna be a little bit draconian on the timekeeping from here on out. During the break, we looked at the questions we had curated from a lot of the ones submitted, and some have been answered by through some of the presentations and commentary. So we're going to focus on 3. So this next segment might be a little bit shorter. If your question isn't asked, you always and you're here tonight, you can always ask it at public comment as well. So our first question came from Todd Waldron, and Maddie's put the question up. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but essentially it's asking, while emission reductions are a key consideration, could you, our panelists, speak to other co-benefits and or impacts that this project, and we're assuming the project means sort of the McNeil enterprise in total, can bring to the table for biodiversity, forest health, and climate resilience. And so, if anybody would like to speak to that.
This
Go
is
ahead.
sort of my wheelhouse of work I work in. As it was mentioned, most of our forests are fairly kind of middle-aged, following we call them second growth, so they're following agricultural land abandonment. A lot of our other forests that weren't cleared were often logged in unsustainable ways. We didn't know a lot about ecology back then. People were opportunistic with harvesting the biggest trees, certain species over others. And we had grazing in a lot of our forests. So these long-term effects have left some of our forests in conditions that maybe aren't what we would consider the most resilient. So they might have limited species diversity, not a lot of different age classes in the forest, things like lacking ecological characteristics like dead logs and dead standing trees. And so there's a number of us that work to encourage landowners and foresters and loggers to add and consider these attributes in their forest management. Actually, Harris has a great document that is published by my colleague at UVM, Dr. Tony D'Amato, and extension colleague down at UMass Amherst, Paul Catanzaro, about managing for old growth characteristics. So we can actually, the idea being that recognizing we need wood products, how can we do that and harvest timber and then elevate and accelerate the forest condition with some of those characteristics. And we know that those characteristics lead to higher resilience in a changing climate. Because I will say one thing that hasn't come up really, although you touched on forest fires, is that climate change is a threat to forests and the carbon that they store and sequester. And so one of these ideas is risk spreading, is having forests that have diversity, complexity, and we have diversity across the landscape. That gives us a lot more resilience when we do get an invasive insect coming in that we don't know about, right? Or that frost event we had a couple weeks ago. I don't know if you were out in the woods, it hurts certain species over others, right? And so we know this, we know diversity and complexity is really beneficial. And so we're doing a lot of that work in our forests. I know lots of foresters that are doing this, lots of landowners that are interested, and so it can complement sustainable forest management.
Yeah, and I have extra copies of this, so I'll leave these here if anyone's interested.
Would anybody else like to comment on that question? If not,
Actually,
yep, go ahead.
Dr. Kaseva and I are now serving on a joint. Dr. Kaseva and I are jointly. We just started working together on a working group in Massachusetts where we're going to try to deal with these kinds of issues. And what she says is very important. We need to understand what are our most resilient forests and which are most likely to be resilient to a changing climate. As you said, I mean, I'm just shocked now when I go into our forests and I just see that, the damage that's being inflicted by invasive species and by, emerald ash borer and woolly adelgid and the beech bark damage and so forth. And yet when I go to see areas that have been recently heavily logged, I find that what's coming back are a lot of invasive species. That was not a problem when all these rules of forestry were put in place, right? I mean, these barberry, for example, we have a lot of it in our area, and it's has 10 times the number of ticks that the native pre-cut area has, so there we have an interesting situation. We have, by benign neglect, we have the largest, most high-density carbon forest in the Northeast, from western Massachusetts up through Vermont, southern Vermont, New Hampshire, all the way up. And it's the only thing that rivals it, of course, are the Adirondacks, which still have have the largest amount of primary forest left in the Northeast. So we need to be, I think we need to read nature and also understand the consequences of our past management or non-management, which has led to the state of the forest that we have today, and then make some decisions. Which of those are we going to be trying to maintain for the operational purposes of the planet, and which are we going to try to maintain for the production purposes of our economy?
Thank you. If no one else wants to speak to that, we'll go to our next question from Alan Thompson. And Alan asks, can sustainable forest management be used to improve carbon storage, sequestration, and climate resilient forests? Anybody want to have a crack at that?
Well, I would say yes. And, that's the goal. It does get complicated by the fact that most of the land in Vermont is privately owned. And of that, probably 2/3, 3/4 of it is small landowners, family-owned properties. It's, the vast majority of the land in Vermont. So you need to also be working with the owner to educate them, to try to help them reach their goals. In some cases, it might be, we want to store the most carbon possible, and that's, we just want to let it grow, and that's all we want to do, and that's fine. And we need that. Other ones, they need to get income from their forest. They just have to in order to keep owning it. And if not, they won't be able to pay their taxes, won't be able to own it. And so we try to help them also, with harvesting and getting income from it, in as sustainable a way as possible. And it's usually doable. It depends what's growing there. But, we don't want to get into a situation where if landowners aren't able to get income from their forests, then we'll just have rich people owning all the land in Vermont, basically is what's going to happen. It's not the way it is right now. You don't have to be a wealthy person. You can kind of keep that land in sustainable production and manage for these other things as well. So I don't know if that answered the question, but yes, I think it is possible.
Anybody else?
I would just say if it keeps trees, if it keeps trees at the age of 50 on average, it's not going to do that job. It just doesn't. Our forests have become ever more through the management that we've had, ever more like tree plantations. I mean, the species that have the highest value are taken out. And for lumber. Now there's also this harvesting for. I still don't understand how. Can somebody tell me how much does somebody get for a ton of what is going to become wood chips that makes it possible for them to keep their land and forest or not? I mean, how much is it?
For us?
Yeah.
Burlington Electric, what do we pay?
Yeah. How much?
He was saying stumpage or at the gate?
No, at the
please-
gate.
please
I mean,
speak into the mic.
What does the landowner get for 1 ton of wood taken off to become burned at? $1 a ton. That's what it is in Massachusetts. That's what it is in Massachusetts. Right.
So like, a lot of this tonight, and I thought the scope was just about the steam plant, really, but it's like, it seems like there's assumption that the harvesting is for McNeil. It's only a small percentage of harvesting in the state sells products from McNeil.
Yep, I'm sure that's true, but I'm hearing that without a market for low-quality wood, landowners won't be able to keep their land and forest.
Because if low-quality wood is worth nothing, right?
Yeah,
What do people want to cut? High-quality wood, right?
that's right.
So if you have low-quality wood markets, the only thing that's worth anything is high-quality wood, or saw log, right? Flooring, furniture, veneer, whatever. And so people aren't going to do sustainable forest management. And so it's like, right? Because why would you? Because you have to pay taxes every year. I'm a forest land, I'm a forester, but I have to pay taxes.
Sure.
So I used to harvest my land this winter. Most of my income was from low-grade products, right? Because I've left most of the high-grade products in my woods. If I didn't make any money from those, what would I have done? I probably would have done the opposite.
So I'm going to bring this back, just because I'm just trying to keep time, but thank you for your remarks. And I didn't know if anybody else wanted to weigh in on this before we continued.
I was just going to make just a brief comment. And it's related to the discussion, but I think what may not be fully understood is when somebody is part of a harvest that is selling wood chips to McNeil, our foresters are working with that property owner to put in place a forest management plan. Now, we may not be the highest value economically in that harvest, but by being a market and by having standards that we have for forest management, we're applying that standard to kind of a broader set of operations. And so I just wanted to kind of, in speaking to the question and getting into the discussion, you know, how can BED play a role? How can McNeil play a role in improving forest management? I think the work of our foresters is really doing that in the properties where we harvest and maybe having an outsized impact both economically and with the forest management plans in supporting sustainable forestry.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to comment on, Bill was mentioning keeping a tree at 50 years old. I would just say, you know, we manage for a diversity of things in our forests, and this is one of the great things about forestry in Vermont is that we have a licensed forester population. So you have to keep up a license to be a forester here. That means continuing education. That means landowners have a management plan. We have the great current use program, our use value appraisal program, and that's allowed for this long-term vision in forest management because you can't have a short-term vision in a forest. You really need to be thinking about trees last a long time, they live a long time, there's lots of dynamics that play out. And so, you know, it really doesn't make sense for a landowner, for a forester to really, oh, I'm gonna liquidate this forest and we're thinking about how do you keep that value over the long term. And also landowners are managing for many, many different things. In addition to timber, right, biodiversity, maybe wildlife habitat, maybe recreation trails, so managing all of that. But, you know, if we had this really myopic view on our forests, we wouldn't have a forest resource. So really, people are managing for multi-aged forests out there, for forest complexity, for thinking about having that diversity on the landscape, and how can we, you know, harvest timber and get some of those attributes in our forests as they develop.
Speak to the issue. So I think one question that I think is worth asking too is back to the like low quality wood products or use of low quality timber. Like, what else could you do with it? Could you know, are there opportunities for like other than burning? I think that's really the question, because immediate transfer to the atmosphere, that's, and granted, I get it that like climate is just one of many things that you could manage a forest for, and it is like what I'm focused on, obviously, but it is also kind of part of where we are in this time, right? Given our climate goals, given our climate reality, can we look to, you know, yes, you need to manage your land in a way that you can live on that land, obviously, that's critically important. Can we, are there other opportunities, other uses that don't transfer the carbon immediately to the atmosphere? I think that's, you know, and can you actually make more money in some cases off of those uses?
Yeah, the two examples that come to mind, since I've lived with both of them, and when I built a home, one is using the smaller pieces to make oriented strand board. I mean, everything from the rafters to the floor joists are all made in I-beams out of oriented strand board. And my daughter just put in new basement stairs. What did they put in? Oriented strand board. That's all unusable for lumber, for making lumber. And the other one, which I think has a wonderful additional value, is of course the cellulosic fiber, which used to go into making newspapers, now makes to go directly into insulation for homes instead of doing what I had to do, which was to use shredded, recycled cellulose fiber from old newspapers. It's one of the best insulations you can get, and it's being used in Europe a lot. There's a company trying to get started up in Maine, and that just keeps on giving for climate change, right? I mean, if you have better insulated walls, you know, what a great use for a low quality leftover part of the tree that you can't use for timber, for lumber.
Just to have a little bit of a reality check, I would love to have an oriented strand board factory in Vermont that I could ship my wood to. Try building one under the current permit regime that we have here now. You're not going to be able to. So, what is really the alternative?
I'd say change the rules.
No, but really, you don't think we were trying?
Yes, yes.
You don't think we're trying to do that?
No.
Yeah.
And I think just to add to that, of course, like this is not, we're not at all saying like, believe me, there's yes, there's so many things that we need to consider and think about how we can like change policy to foster the kind of action that we want to see, right? That's what we're here tonight to talk about, and it is complex and difficult. I think also to speak to your point about landowners' decisions. We know you need to find ways to incentivize people, right? To manage for carbon. Why else would you manage for carbon unless you're not, if you're not being compensated for that in some way? It's a social good. And I'm not saying that's simple or easy and that, we can wave a magic wand and boom, the policy's there, but it's something that we need to work towards, I think, in the current reality.
And other states are doing that right now, working toward it. They don't have it yet, but that's on the agenda. So there's always a first time.
If I can just offer a brief comment. I think the reason that folks are clapping is because McNeil is the market for lower value wood, and they would love a competitive market that offered a higher price than what we're able to pay. And that doesn't exist in Vermont. And so, I just want to bring that, consistent with what Harris was saying, like, it's great to talk about those things, and those are good things, and we love weatherization. We have a weatherization program. But in the reality of Vermont, 2023, McNeil is providing that market, and there is not an alternative, and I don't think an alternative is going to present itself in the, kind of near term that would be along the lines that you're suggesting, even though I think we all agree that would be a good thing, and we'd be interested in that. So I just wanted to speak to it.
Yeah. It's a business opportunity. Let's leave it at that.
Well, thank you for those comments. We are going to, in the interest of time, it's 8:38, we're here till 9:30. We know there's a lot of people who want to speak, so we're going to go to public comment next, public forum. I have the sign-up sheet. We're going to do it a little bit differently than normal public forums you may have attended. We're going to do 5 speakers for 2 minutes maximum, and then we're going to allow our panelists to comment on what they've heard. And we're going to do that up to 3 times. So I don't think we're going to make it all the way through, but we'll give it a go. Our first person to speak is Jill Clark Gollin. No? The next person is Rich Golub. No? Judy Dow. Excellent. There's one.
So, give me a... There you go.
Make sure your mic's on too.
Thank you. I served on the Ag and Ecosystem Committee, the Biomass Task Force, and the life cycle analysis with most of these people. And there are several things I learned. The first thing I learned was that they had different definitions for sustainable, renewable, and net zero. I taught school for 38 years, so I had a steep learning curve. The second thing I learned was that I had to keep track of all of this. So I created a bullshit detector to help me with that. And it covered everything from white lies to malicious and serious lies. And it's still happening. So like tonight, we heard one statement from Jared Ulmer about biomass, but on that same presentation he gave, he didn't recommend biomass. So there's a lot of flipping and flopping of comments that has been happening here tonight. The other area that hasn't been discussed is the archaeology. And there was a meeting sometime here in January, and I think it was January, and Darren, you said that you had all the archaeological reports done that needed to be done, and they were all approved. And I want to let you know that the one that was just recently done was turned back to be redone. And my question to you is, has it been completed in a proper format? And there are many other things that have come up here today that have been bothersome to me. And some of them include the life cycle analysis that Vermont has just requested be done on an annual basis. And, okay, thank you.
Next is Phil Merrick.
I think I had a 4-minute thing set up here because I didn't know we'd have the 2-minute timer, so I'm going to have to kind of wing it. So one of the things that I see happening a lot is false accounting. What Darren put up earlier tonight was a good example of that, where he showed how much sequestration had happened in the plots and how much they'd burned and compared it. But he didn't compare how much sequestration would have been in that plot had they not cut the plot. And so it's really, that's false accounting, because if you're going to claim, and this is greenhouse gas rules, if you're going to claim a removal of greenhouse gas from the atmosphere, you have to show additionality. And what you showed was subtraction. There was no additionality there. And then when Adam talks about landscape values for sequestration, that's false accounting, because that's my landscape. You can't take the landscape up on Camel's Hump and apply that to your electric generation. You can only use your land where you cut. And that's called operational boundaries, and it is also greenhouse gas rules. So you guys got to get your accounting together, and you need to tell the people of the city how much carbon dioxide is coming out of the stack. And don't tell me it's like 85% more efficient when you're not even telling the public that there's 400,000 tons coming out of the stack. It's false accounting. Let's get the accounting straight and then come back and have this discussion again. Would that be good? Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Next, we have Joe Nelson. And after that is Nick Persampierre. After.
So I'm Joe Nelson. I'm a forester. I live down in Ferrisburg. Been practicing forestry for 35 years, and I've been working with Burlington Electric over the years as I manage private lands. I have to make decisions all the time about how I'm going to manage those lands. I talk to my clients, get their input, and then I make decisions about the harvesting system that I'm going to use and the markets that I'm going to utilize. And sometimes I decide that it's appropriate to use Burlington Electric as one of the markets for the harvest that I manage. And when that happens, I contact Burlington Electric. I talk to the boys back here, Seth, Don, and Kevin, and Betsy. I know them all. They know all of us out here in the world of forestry, and we have a great relationship. They come out and they spend time with us in the woods so that we get it right, so that we know what we're doing, so that we know we're not harming bats. That's one thing especially in the Champlain Valley, we have to be very careful about bat habitat when we're doing a BED harvest. That doesn't happen except if we're using BED as a market. Those folks are really professional. We use them all the time. And then we put together prescriptions. We have interactions with Burlington Electric foresters about what the prescription will be. They give us input about layout of the harvest, the roads, protecting water quality, protecting biodiversity, and utilizing that market. It allows me to protect and improve biodiversity through the better utilization of low-grade markets. I can get rid of certain species that are overabundant in certain areas. I can create more diversity in the forest, and I really enjoy working with them.
Nick Persampieri, I live in Burlington, Ward 2. Burlington Electric relies extensively on a memo prepared by VEIC in April 2022, including for the preposterous conclusion that McNeil reduces greenhouse gas emissions by at least 85% compared to natural gas generators. That conclusion is reached by not counting the emissions going out of the stack. This report has no credibility whatsoever. You look at first, VEIC in July 2012 acquired the Biomass Energy Resource Center. That is a pro-biomass organization which works to advance the use of biomass energy throughout North America and beyond. Adam Sherman ran that program. He was the manager of BERC. He continues to manage that program now at VEIC. Mr. Sherman has also been a member of the board of the Biomass Thermal Energy Council, which, among other things, lobbies for the biomass industry. He's been on the editorial board of Biomass Magazine, and he serves on the Alliance for Green Heat, which promotes wooden pellet stoves. And the other author of the report, Damon Lane, admits that the carbon emitted by burning wood is sequestered during a human time scale, so he admits to the time element. And he concludes, while I don't believe biogenic emissions are as bad as fossil fuels, stopping all combustion as soon as possible needs to be the goal. Thank you.
And our last speaker in this round is Fred Glansberg.
Okay, so my name is Fred Glansberg. I am a forester working out of Randolph, Vermont. I guess the first thing I'd like to say is that I myself and most of my associates and colleagues here are working diligently to try to maintain a resilient growing forest. In order to have that, it's been acknowledged in much of the training I've been going through lately that we need to establish a diversity of age classes within the stand. Where we are taking I hear a lot about not growing trees to size. Much of the trees that are going to the biomass plant, a good example would be diseased beech trees, which we have an awful lot of. So a lot of our work is making a group. We try to keep them between a quarter to a half an acre. Sometimes they get as large as 4 or more. But these are deteriorating trees. We're doing two things. One, if I have a younger age class developing in places, I try to open that up to allow that to grow vigorously. We are maintaining large trees within the stands that we cut, and certainly keeping all this in mind. So the last thing I'd say, one example of a biomass harvest that we recently completed was on a dairy farm, which is now converting to grass-fed dairy, which I think can be generally acknowledged as a much more carbon-friendly way of producing milk. In order to do that, they need more pasture. We cleared 5 acres of pasture to add to their land base. We also took approximately 25% of the saw timber and low-grade timber out of the woods to supplement their income.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fred. And now I'd like to allow our panelists to comment on what they've heard from the public forum speakers. Go ahead, Darren.
Just a couple brief comments. For Judy, for the archaeology studies, I'm assuming you're referencing Act 250 documents for district heat. If that's the case, Burlington District Energy, which is the nonprofit that was formed to support the potential financing construction operation of the district heat project, is managing the Act 250 filing. And so they're taking that work on, and if there's a document that they submitted that was turned back, I'm confident they'll work on that. Okay. Okay. We know that there are archaeological areas within McNeil that we purposefully make sure are not disturbed. But in terms of the district heat project, they're managing that. The only other archaeological kind of study that I'm aware of would be related to, we're putting in a solar test center with UVM as part of a change in our wastewood yard. So those are the two that I'm aware of. I don't know what you're referencing if it's not the solar test center or the district heat project, but I don't recall what you're referencing, but try to provide some context if I could. In addition, relative to the stack emissions, I just want to be really, really clear. Our reports that I shared tonight in the PowerPoint reference the stack emissions. They're all right there. They're in blue in that chart. So for Phil, who I've met with,
I wasn't talking about stack emissions. I was talking about the sequestration on the land where the wood was harvested.
No, I understand, and I think you may have made a comment, or there may have been another comment about the stack emissions. We are referencing the stack emissions. We report them annually. They're not a secret. They're out there for the public. They're in the report. There's some interesting kind of discussion around counterfactuals, right? If we weren't doing X, would we be getting more sequestration? Those are all interesting. But we are doing sustainable harvesting. We are seeing net additions of carbon on the lands where we harvest. I think that's an important point I want to reemphasize. And I also want to reemphasize, with respect to kind of some of the discussion earlier, we turn off McNeil, you don't end up with more wind or more solar or more hydro. The New England grid does not have that to offer. If you turn off McNeil, you have more natural gas. And my understanding was this community back in 2004 made a commitment that we don't want more nuclear and we don't want more fossil fuel. And fossil fuel is the driver of the climate crisis. We know that. And we want to move towards renewable energy. And that's what we've done. And that's why we've done it. And so with McNeil, we're not at a point where, and maybe there's a point at some point distant in the future where you could rely on those resources, but we're not at that point now, and we're not at that point in the near future, and I just wanted to emphasize that.
So I also thanks for that, and I think to have those conversations about counterfactuals, and also want to again applaud the work that you're doing, that BED's doing in terms of what we're hearing about sustainable harvests and benefits to biodiversity, et cetera. I just also wanted to share, because there was also this question about stand level versus landscape level. And while I don't have time tonight to go into the details of our model, but I wanted to share with you actually a global model, and also to address this question of what is the driver of the climate crisis, right? The driver of the climate crisis is is greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, whether they come, and whether a molecule of CO2 comes from coal, oil, natural gas, or wood, it has exactly the same radiative forcing impact in the atmosphere, right? It behaves the same way. If I can share my screen for just a moment, I'll share with you this model that is a global model. It's called En-ROADS, and I'm happy to dive into it more deeply, but partly from the bioenergy modeling work that we did, we've brought that into a global scale. And you can look and see what happens if here you've got the global mix of energy, so coal, oil, natural gas, renewable solar, wind, hydro, and then this pink is bioenergy. These are global emissions out to 2100 and the resulting temperature increase. If we do what basically we're doing at McNeil, which is to provide a subsidy for wood bioenergy, and we did that at a global level, what you see is that CO2 net emissions go up and temperature actually goes up. So I don't think there's a question about, do we have enough solar, wind, energy efficiency, all that? No, we don't. We need more. Do we have a climate crisis? Yes, we know we have a climate crisis. Do landowners need help with having incentives to manage their land for this new climate crisis? Yes. The question really is more wood bioenergy the solution that we need right now or no? And I think that's it's hard, but I think we get more warming, not less, if we increase the use of bioenergy. That's unfortunately the reality.
Do others want to comment on this?
Yeah, I was just curious if the model accounts for whether it was switched to natural gas, would that go up even more in that model? I mean, I think that's what we're talking about, is like, if not McNeil, then natural gas, and that's the crux of it. So if you're comparing it against nothing, you're going to see a net increase.
Yeah, no, if you compare wood to natural gas, you have a higher carbon intensity for wood, right?
And you lose the capacity, the growth capacity of the wood that was
To
harvested.
sequester CO2, that's right, so yeah.
And there is a real-world example of this. It's in Tasmania, Australia, which may annoy people here, but it's the only place it's actually happened. They stopped harvesting half the forest there. And within 10 years, they went from being net emission as an entire state to being net negative. In other words, the avoided emissions from harvesting. There's an amazing studies that have been done by the U.S. Forest Service about the emissions that come from forestry. And in fact, the leading cause of the death of trees is harvesting. It's 5 times greater than fire and insects and land conversion and everything else. I mean, we talk about a few thousand or 10,000 acres being converted. But the emissions from that are dwarfed by the emissions that occur from harvesting. Now, that doesn't mean we should stop harvesting because of that, but it means we should do it more carefully. And I was very pleased that the one gentleman who came up and spoke about how he was advising his clients in terms of how to manage their harvests. So it's just a case that we're doing so many things that are causing emissions. And I would agree with the person who said we have to get the accounting right, and we can't have accounting that is misleading. So let's see if we can all agree that we'll all try to do the accounting properly, that as it appears in the atmosphere, and therefore with climate.
Thank you. We're going to go to the next round, and the first public speaker is going to be Luke McNeil, followed by Jeff Comstock.
I would like to introduce the fields of forest restoration, forest stand improvement, and managing young forests for old forest characteristics. Many wildlife species depend on really old forest characteristics. These species include black bear, pine marten, flying squirrels, northern goshawk, and wood thrush. Other species of warblers, whippoorwill, flycatchers, wood turtle, box turtle, common five-line skink, and the eastern rat snake require young forests for either part or all of their habitat needs. The fact that the northern goshawk, an old forest-dwelling species, preys upon the rough grouse, a young forest-dwelling species, demonstrates the interconnectedness of forest ecosystems. Our forests in Vermont are now existing in a state of recovery from human disturbances. Hundreds of years ago, this balance between young forests and old forests would have been maintained by beavers, fires, floods, and other forms of disturbance that tip the scales between disturbance and stability. Sustainable forestry enhances both young and old forest characteristics. What we're doing in Vermont currently is moving toward a forested landscape mosaic where we have the greatest diversity of forest conditions, including both shrublands and thickets of young forests, which are really good at taking a lot of carbon out of the air, as well as ever-aging and older forests that are really good at storing carbon that was sequestered already. And Vermont is a thought leader in this space. I have a booklet here on managing and restoring old forest characteristics, but it takes some active management to enhance some of these legacy trees and create some of the really old forest characteristics that Dr. Mumma has referenced, and we can do this through active management. This is from UVM, by the way. Oh, thank you very much. Sustainable forestry is a lot easier on the land than any other land use.
You got 10 seconds left in that?
This is a triple bottom line win-win-win solution that helps reduce our dependence on fossilized carbon. I think it's a wonderful idea, and I urge you to join me in supporting it.
Thank you. After Jeff is Cheryl Joy Lipton.
Hello, my name is Jeff Comstock. I live here in Burlington, and it's my understanding that Burlington Electric essentially operates as a vertically integrated utility, even though you operate within the New England ISO system. And I bring up that operating distinction because I came across some data reported from AARP that highlights the average household utility costs, energy costs across the country, and the New England ISO is the highest energy expenditure for common households across the country. And that operational distinction is also important because if you look across the country, all of the areas of the country that have the highest household energy costs are all in the ISO operating parts of the country. So let's see. Let's see. Yeah, so I guess the point I wanted to make about that is that I think that it is somewhat of a self-righteous expectation that Burlington or the state of Vermont is going to solve the climate crisis and all by itself, okay? So I think that the city council and the state legislature ultimately have a decision, or the decisions made cannot be disadvantaging Burlington or the state of Vermont because I think our governing bodies actually have a responsibility to deal with the cost of living and the affordability in New England, where we're already operating in a highly cost disadvantaged part of the country. And so I ask that you take that into consideration in terms of your future support of the
Thanks, Jeff.
BED. Thank you.
Next is Cheryl Joy Lipton, followed by Howard Jennings.
Hi, thanks. I'm an ecologist and I live in Chester, and I think it matters to me also, even though I don't live in Burlington, because this is the same forest as for everybody. It matters to us here in Vermont. It matters to people in Australia. It matters to everyone, everywhere. It's not just a Burlington issue. One thing I think that people have forgotten is that we're not talking about not harvesting. We're just talking about not burning the trees, not burning the wood. I do want to, and as was said, we should have stopped burning a long time ago. What's the answer? Instead of burning the wood, no, it's not gas. No, it's not fossil fuels. It's reducing our consumption. We can't keep living the way we do. We shouldn't have been increasing our consumption from a long time ago. All of us here, when we were younger, consumed a lot less. I do want to bring up a couple of things that that are erroneously spoken about, and one of them is biodiversity and old forests and old growth. And the fact that you can manage for old growth characteristics doesn't mean you can actually have an old forest. There are some lichen species and insects that don't show up for many decades, many hundreds of years, actually. And you can't make that happen. You can have some dead things laying around, you can increase coarse woody debris, etc. But you can't actually create an old forest until the actual forest gets that old. Okay, well, we need to stop burning things, and it's not fossil fuels, it's greenhouse gases. Yep, thanks.
Next is Howard Jennings, to be followed by Ashley Adams.
Thank you. I'd like to add a couple of notes of time frame to this. As has been noted, we're at 1.1 or 1.2 degrees Celsius above the baseline. And at 1.5, we are very likely to be over a tipping point of no return. And the IPCC tells us that's going to happen between 2030 and 2040. That's 7 to 17 years from now. And I am deathly afraid that my 2-year-old grandson is going to spend his entire life in an increasingly degraded world because we're going to miss those deadlines, and it's going to get worse and worse and worse. And if we think it's bad now, just check in 5 years on the level of disasters and their frequency that are happening. So the message is that one of the most immediate things we can do to stave this off is keep old forests standing. All the other new carbon sequestration technologies take time to ramp up and build up, secure capital and all of that. Right now is when we need this climate sequestration. And as has been documented by some of Dr. Mumaw's and others' research, when you cut a stand for whatever purpose, that stand, the cut area, becomes a net source of carbon to the atmosphere for about 20 years before it becomes a net carbon sink. So that tells me and all of us that we really need to be careful about what we cut a stand for. So anything that's not an absolutely essential use of the wood needs to be really scrutinized hard. So non-essential optional uses, and biomass is one of those, need to be carefully ramped down, not ramped up, and permitted for another 10 or 20 years. There are lots of competing interests of great value here, but we have to look to this big picture here and not continue business as usual right now. And I'm afraid that's what the McNeil plant will do, is permit for 10 years, business as usual. So, thank you.
Thank you. Next is Ashley Adams.
Hi, thank you. First of all, I'm so grateful to have two members of the scientific community here with us this evening. And can everyone hear me? I am so grateful to have two members of the scientific community here with us this evening. And I cringe quite a bit when I sit here and see this false equivalency between the science and the biomass promoters. I think that, it's clear that we have a choice. Do we burn wood and hence continue pumping over 400,000 tons of CO2 into the atmosphere every year and simultaneously take down the very things, the trees, that are sequestering that carbon? So that's our choice. I think that's very simple. Sure, there are economic considerations. Those are policy issues that must be dealt with, okay? Everyone needs to make a living. Everyone deserves to support themselves, and that's an equitability issue. That's a policy issue. That is not a climate issue. I just needed to say that, and I'm happy for folks on the panel to respond, but I am up to my eyeballs with hearing from Burlington Electric and the greenwashing bullshit that I've been subjected to as a Burlington resident all these years. So had it with that. Happy to hear from the experts. Thank you. Pardon the language.
And that concludes our next round of 5, and we'll go to our panelists for comment for 10 minutes.
I'll just make a quick comment on the point about growing trees to sequester carbon and store carbon, and how important that is to do right now, which it absolutely is. But I, tie that in with the fact that the wood, at least that I sent to McNeil, and I don't know what the statistic was, 85% of it, is the tops and the branches and the stuff. The trees are getting cut anyways for the saw logs. It's not, in my mind, going to reduce a whole lot of the amount of trees getting cut by not sending them to McNeil, if that makes sense.
Happy to just offer a few thoughts. First, I appreciate that we're all coming at this from a climate standpoint, regardless of kind of what perspective folks are bringing. I've spent my entire career working on climate and energy. I wanted to work at Burlington Electric because we were the first 100% renewable utility. It's my utility. I'm a Burlington resident, and I think we're doing quite a bit well. And folks here can agree and disagree, and that's great. That's what we're here to do. I want to just say that the proximate decision before us is not whether or not to open a wood chip electric plant. We have a wood chip electric plant. It's a key part of our portfolio. It's a key part of the Vermont reliability and the New England system reliability in this region. The question that's before us and that we've been working on is, should we try to make that plant more efficient? Should we try to use the steam and waste heat from that plant to reduce natural gas in our community? And that's the question that's before us, and that's an important question. McNeil has a role to play regardless of district heat. McNeil is important for us from an electric standpoint, from a reliability standpoint, from an economic standpoint, and some of us would argue from a climate standpoint. So I would just want to refocus the discussion a little bit on that proximate question, because that's really what's before us as a community in the coming months. And just lastly, I know, and it's a good debate to have, and I appreciate and respect the professor's viewpoint on this. Absolutely, it is greenhouse gas emissions that matter. But my understanding, and I came to Burlington Electric without a preconception about McNeil, and we've dug in on this issue. My understanding is with wood, if managed sustainably, if managed to create net additions in the forests, you can have a sequestration and storage of those emissions. We can debate the timescale. We can debate whether having the tops and the limbs is creating a better result than would otherwise be the case. With fossil fuels, there is no resequestration. There is no storage. That carbon goes one way. It goes up and it stays up, and it's creating climate change. And that's why we do the work that we do, and that's why we care. And we can debate that all day long, and maybe we will.
Scientists just talked about that for half an hour.
Please, this won't help us.
I'm just trying to make the simple point that for us, that fossil fuel never is resequestered. It goes up one way. The biogenic emissions have a life cycle, and that's the main point that I was trying to make.
Just one correction to that is that the emissions from fossil fuels are sequestered by trees. In fact, there's a whole international market in buying offsets.
Yeah, that's another problem.
Many of which are fraudulent, by the way. But nonetheless, the idea is, if I pay you to keep your trees growing, I get to keep emitting my carbon dioxide from my fossil fuels. This is almost the same sort of thing. It's saying that we're going to use wood, and the claim is made that, okay, so more trees grew, but wouldn't still more trees have grown had those trees not been harvested and burned? I think that's pretty clear. In fact, okay.
And again, it's back to where is the carbon stored? And I also just want to say, like, I 100%, like, I I feel like we're getting it, like, I have a huge amount of respect for you, and I just want to say, like, thank you for the work that you've done, and there's no reason to say that, like, based on the science that was available at the time, what you're saying made sense. And the problem is that we're in a different situation now, and we know that the carbon is not, like, compared to gas, it's worse. The carbon intensity, at the stack is about 1.5 times of coal, and the payback times are too long. It's just the reality. So it's not like anybody's, I feel like in a way you're in this like super hard position because you're rightly proud of the work that Burlington has done to be on the forefront of climate action. It's like my alma mater is Colby College, and they're also claiming carbon neutrality because they're burning biomass, which made sense a while ago, but it doesn't make sense now. I think that's the thing that's a kind of, I'm sorry, it is past my bedtime, so I am a little bit tired right now, but there was one other point that I wanted to make, which was the cost issue. There was a really important point raised about the cost of electricity here in New England and how it's so expensive. But I'm not in the weeds on this like you are. I don't know all the details, but what would the cost of this plant be if you weren't able to sell RECs or buy RECs? And, if there was no, which I would wager that there will not be a REC market for energy produced at McNeil with wood. And if that were the case, right now you have subsidized electricity. Yes. If it weren't subsidized,
it wouldn't be due.
I would have a hard time believing that it would be less expensive than the alternatives of energy efficiency, solar, wind, and hydro that we have now. We have to build and acknowledge we have to ramp them up. It's not like that. I get that. But we do have the opportunity to build them, to make that choice.
I'd also just like to add that time is running out. The scientists, the IPCC has asked, how many more tons can we burn and stay below 1.5 degrees? This is a silly accounting as far as I'm concerned. We basically have to be reducing by about 25 or 30% a year from right now on for the next 10 years. And we're not doing that. We're not even doing 3%. We're increasing by 3% a year. So we're going in the absolute wrong direction. So we have to get hold of that. And as Juliet said, the cost of improving, I prefer to call it energy productivity rather than energy conservation. Do the same job with less energy. Provide the same energy service. Amory Lovins once said, nobody needs energy. Everyone went horrified. What do you mean we don't need energy? No, what we need are energy services, the services that energy provides. How can we do that with the least amount of energy at the end? And of course, the most dramatic example we have with that is the development of LEDs, 6 times more efficient, use 1/6 the energy for the same amount of light as a tungsten lamp. We're not going to see a whole lot of technological innovations with that kind of a gain. But that made a huge, that actually slowed the growth of electricity demand as that has come in. But we need more of that. And some of it's behavioral. That doesn't cost anything except a few moments of thought when you do something. I just went upstairs, I had to use the restroom here. I went to wash my hands, I almost scalded them. The hottest water that the human hands should ever touch is less than 115 degrees. Those must have been 140 or more. And it would save money. It would save pollution, right? Most of our buildings in the summer, even here in Vermont and Massachusetts, are over air conditioned. These are things we can do just by turning a little dial. This is not hugely expensive. And I just like to comment on one other thing. Somebody said we shouldn't think that Vermont and Burlington can make a difference. The United Nations has this great treaty. It points the direction, but it's not going to remove a single molecule of carbon dioxide. It says what we ought to do, and we've all agreed we're going to do, and then we, as our governments, have not done. National governments. The action is at the state level, it's at the city level, and it's at the household level. That's how we're going to get this thing solved. And I think if we all do that, I mean, you could reduce the emissions coming out of this stack of McNeil by using less electricity. And that's something that we can all find ways of doing. So, you know, don't assume we can pawn this off to somebody else or wait for fusion power or direct air capture. You know how much energy it takes to capture 1 pound of carbon dioxide? It costs about $500. We don't have enough $500 to do enough carbon dioxide to make it matter. So we've got to do it ourselves. So do it at Burlington, do it in Vermont, do it at home.
We're sort of running out of time. Like, I knew we had a packed agenda when we started, but we're at 9:21. We need to start wrapping up. I know that there are still some folks in the public forum queue. Know that this is a conversation that we will be continuing in the coming months. So there'll be other opportunities. But at this point, I'd like to offer our panelists an opportunity to make any closing remarks that they might want to make, and then we will wrap.
I just want to say I'm so impressed. You know, I am incredibly, it's like 9:20 and you're all still here. So,
And it's a school night, right?
so I just want to say I am so impressed with the engagement, and this is what democracy is. This is what climate action is. And thank you for, you know, I'm going to be able to go home and say I'm glad I came. So thank you.
I would certainly second that. I think this is a great sign of involvement and engagement, and that's what we need. And with our country so ripped apart politically and every other way, to be able to come together and have a discussion like this, where we don't all agree on everything about it, but they're willing to sit here and listen to each other, that's really important for getting the problem solved. I mean, addressing climate change is about cooperating. And if we can get the numbers right, we'll be able to get the job done right.
Yeah, I want to agree with a lot of what you've said on energy efficiency and a lot of the work that needs to happen there. We may not fully agree on district heat or wood energy. I appreciate that there are folks with different views in the room, many of whom are Burlington Electric customers, and we appreciate and respect your engagement. I hope you appreciate what we're trying to bring in terms of information. We'll continue to engage on the topic. We'll continue to do the work, the broader work on net zero that we're trying to do with electric vehicles and heat pumps and all the other technologies that we're looking to use to reduce emissions, and appreciate the TEUC for holding the forum. So thank you.
Yeah, just appreciate being here and being invited and hearing all the different views, and just giving my kind of global take on it is that, you know, we just have this abundant local renewable resource and chance to make McNeil more efficient with the district heat, and it just makes a lot of sense to me.
Okay, well.
Is there a way to submit written comments?
Sure. Before we get to maybe that, well, I'll offer any of the TEUC members here with me if they'd like to say anything, and then do you have anything you'd like to say?
Just thank you for all of you. Thank you to all of you for coming.
It's dangerous to give me the microphone.
Start the timer.
Start the timer, yeah. We wanted this to be a conversation, not a debate. I think it was. And so thank you all, because what I was looking when I initiated this brainiac idea was to see if we could come to some common understandings about science, to come to understandings about language, so that we could have the disagreements about policy, talking not like ships passing in the night. And I think we're closer to that. I don't think we're there yet, and I think the TEUC needs to be working to get those comments and try to figure out a way that we can do that. And maybe this will have advanced the conversation so we don't replicate this the next time, but maybe we talk about, how to pro-forestation and be able to get the tops and be able to increase the efficiencies and reduce emissions at the stack. Well, wouldn't that be frickin' amazing, right? So, but I do think that, hope dies last. So we are in this, and I want to thank you. Thank you for being respectful. Thank you for bringing up babies. And I always bring up at the city council the babies. So we have a lot of work to do. Hopefully, we will have the time in the conversation about district energy that will allow us to sort through some of this stuff. I don't think that we are there yet, but I actually think there are glimmers of hope that says that we can be there for BED and be there for the foresters and the people that own those properties, be there for those of us who are having a hard time paying the bills, and those babies. And if we can squeeze out the time, knowing full well the time is really tight all the way around, who knows what we could accomplish. So thank you all for indulging us.
And I'll get the final word. Thank you all. I agree with everything Gene said. I was hoping we'd come out of here tonight with sort of a common understanding, a common sort of framework to move forward in. I'd also think I have some questions. We had an enormous amount of information that we've been presented tonight and talked about, and it's going to take me a little bit of time to sort of, go through it again and develop some questions, and that'll be part of the next conversation that we have. To the gentleman who asked if we would accept written comments, certainly you could direct them to the members of the TEUC if you'd like. I don't have a form up. I suppose what I could do is put a form up if people want to enter comments about the symposium. I will commit to doing that, and it'll be under this agenda item on the TEUC webpage. Again, that URL is burlingtonvt.gov/citycouncil/TEUC, TEUC. And you'll see this meeting along with the material there, and I'll form a link to there that you can submit comments on. And I will also ask if our presenters tonight could provide their slide deck so that I can put that up there as well. And I also want to thank Maddie Saunders, who's our person from DPW who is committed to staying here tonight and helping us with all the technical aspects of it, and into Town Meeting TV for also covering it for us tonight. So thank you, everybody. Have a good night.